The afternoon had gone quiet in the way that great houses go quiet in late October, when the visiting party has dispersed to their rooms and the servants move on softer feet, and even the fire seems to hold its breath. The drawing room at Ashmore Park smelled of beeswax and chrysanthemums and the particular cold that crept beneath the long windows when the season turned. Elspeth Vale stood at the mantelpiece with a chamois cloth in her hand, working the brass candlesticks in slow, methodical passes, and she was singing. She did not know she was singing. It was the kind of song that rises without permission, a melody without a title, something learned so long ago it had become bone rather than memory. The words, when they came, were in a low, unhurried voice, clear as water over stone, and they described a garden in some unnamed summer where the roses were white and the bees were loud, and a small girl had made a crown of clover for a woman sitting in the grass. Lady Constance Mourned, Dowager Marchioness of Ashmore, had opened the drawing-room door to retrieve her embroidery. She did not retrieve it. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and the other pressed flat against her own sternum, and the blood left her face in a single slow tide. The maid did not see her. The maid went on polishing and went on singing, and the song continued through the third verse that Lady Constance had not heard in 12 years, the verse about the clover crown and the bees, and a name that the girl in the song called out across the garden because it was time to come inside. It was time for supper. It was growing late. The name in the song was Mama. Lady Constance had lost a daughter 12 years ago on the road to Bath. The carriage had gone over in the dark on a wet October evening, and the coachman had survived, and the maid who accompanied them had survived with a broken arm, and the child, 11 years old, had not been found among the dead, and had not been found among the living. There had been a river close to the road. There had been a week of searching. There had been a grave left empty in the churchyard at Ashmore, because there had been no body to put in it. The maid at the mantelpiece reached the end of the third verse. She stopped singing and polished the last candlestick and set it back in its place with a small, decisive click. She turned to move to the next piece, and she saw Lady Constance in the doorway, and she dropped into the curtsy that 6 weeks at Ashmore Park had drilled into her, neat and unthinking, her eyes cast correctly down. "My lady," she said, "I did not hear you enter. Forgive me." Lady Constance Mourned said nothing at all. She looked at the girl for a long moment, at the plain brown dress and the white cap and the hands that still held the chamois cloth, at the posture that was, even in service, somehow too straight for the station, at the face that was. But she could not complete the thought. She was 57 years old, and she had learned in the years since the accident to distrust the mind's desire to find the dead in the faces of strangers. She had seen her daughter in market towns. She had seen her in Bath, in Bristol, once in the features of a girl selling ribbons in a London street. The mind would do what grief instructed it to do. "What is your name?" Lady Constance said, and her voice was very level. "Elspeth, my lady." The dowager's hand tightened on the doorframe. She said, "That will be all," and waited until the girl had left the room with her cloth and her small curtsy, and then she crossed to the settee and sat down very carefully, as though she might break, and she did not move for a long time. The song ran through her head in the girl's clear voice. She told herself it meant nothing. Maids had voices. Maids knew old songs. The name was a common enough name. Vale was a common enough surname. And the face was the face that grief made of strangers' faces. She was 57, and she had been deceived before. She would not be deceived again. She retrieved her embroidery. She went upstairs. She did not sleep. She had come to Ashmore Park 6 weeks earlier on the recommendation of Mrs. Aldridge, the apothecary's widow in the village of Stretton Cross, who had known Mrs. Holt the housekeeper for 30 years and written on the girl's behalf in the plainest terms. "She is honest," the letter said. "She works hard. She reads better than most gentry daughters I have met, and she is in need of a position." No mention was made in the letter of how Elspeth had come to be in Stretton Cross, and no mention was made of the locket. Elspeth had arrived in Stretton Cross when she was 11 years old. Mr. Aldridge, then living, had found her at the edge of the road in the early morning, following a night of hard rain, sitting in the long grass with her shoes missing, and a small cut above her left eye, and no knowledge whatsoever of her own name. She had known the names of flowers. She had known the words to songs. She had known her letters and her French, and how to hold a teacup, and the names of the constellations and the capital cities of most of Europe. And she had remembered none of that by deliberate learning, but by the mysterious persistence of things drilled early enough to outlast the blow that had taken her name away. Mr. Aldridge had carried her home to his wife. He had put notices in 3 county newspapers. No one had come. The locket had been in the mud beside her. It was a small oval thing on a slender chain, the gold worn but real, and inside it was a miniature portrait of a dark-haired woman of perhaps 25, elegantly dressed, with a composed and lovely face. Elspeth had kept it always. She wore it always. It was the only thing in the world that was certainly and originally hers. Her memories had returned, not in a single flood, but in small installments over the years, the way snow accumulates before anyone thinks to name it. A garden, white roses, the smell of a particular soap, a voice reading to her from a book of Greek myths at bedtime, a carriage rocking in the dark, and a feeling of cold, wet air, and then nothing. She had told Mr. Aldridge about the memories, and he had listened without alarm and said, gently, that some things came back and some things did not, and the most important thing was to live the life that was in front of her. She had tried to be what the Aldridges had made her. She had helped in the shop. She had been educated past her station and had not complained of it. She had learned to be useful with her hands because she had no rank to trade on. And when Mrs. Aldridge had written to Mrs. Holt at Ashmore, Elspeth had packed her single bag with the seriousness of someone who understood that the world's patience for women without obvious origin was not unlimited. She had not known, when she applied, that the estate was called Ashmore. She had not known. When she walked through the servants' entrance on a gray Tuesday morning, that something inside her chest would tighten at the smell of the halls, at the long corridor with the green carpet, at the particular angle of the light through the east wing windows. She had told herself it was nerves. She had told herself she was projecting. She was a practical woman, or she had learned to be, and practical women did not build houses of coincidence and call them proof. She wore the locket inside her collar. She kept it there, close to the skin, the way one keeps the things that cannot be explained or replaced. The season had brought a small party to Ashmore Park. The Marquis of Ashmore, Julian Mourned, was not a man who invited large parties. His wife had died 2 years earlier in her confinement at the estate, and the house still wore its grief quietly in the rooms he did not use, and the piano that remained closed, and the portrait in the East Gallery he had not yet taken down, but could not yet pass without walking faster. He had invited his mother's guest and companion, Miss Dorothea Payne, and 2 old friends, and he had presided at dinner with the competent courtesy of a man who had learned to be present without being there. Miss Dorothea Payne was 22 and well-looking, and exactly what Lady Constance had selected for him, which was the primary difficulty. She was kind in the careful way of women who have been taught that kindness is a social tool. She wore ice blue at dinner and spoke intelligently about the right number of subjects, and deferred to Julian with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed the deference without having been told to rehearse it. She was not unkind to Elspeth. She simply did not see her. One morning, passing through the front hall as a guest paused to ask Elspeth a question about the library, Miss Payne said, without stopping, "You would do better to ask one of the senior staff, Mr. Fellows. The new maid will not have been given the full tour," and continued up the stairs with her skirts a precise inch above the carpet. Mr. Fellows looked embarrassed. Elspeth looked at nothing and said, "Of course, sir," and directed him to Mrs. Holt, and felt the familiar sensation of being adjusted downward one notch in a room's assessment, and adjusted to it, as she had adjusted to it in various rooms throughout her life. Lady Constance had been in the hallway. She had heard Miss Payne's phrase. She had watched the maid's face, which showed nothing at all, and something in that careful nothing made her feel slightly ill. She told herself it was indigestion. She told herself it several more times across the afternoon. The library at Ashmore was 2 floors of shelved books behind a balconied gallery, and the fire that burned there on cold evenings had the quality of a fire that has burned in the same place for 100 years. Julian had retreated there the Thursday evening after the guests had taken their tea and dispersed, and he had been standing at the upper gallery, pulling a volume from the shelf, when he heard footsteps on the library stairs. He had not moved. He observed from above the maid who had been assigned the upper rooms, climbing with her lamp in one hand and a list in the other, and he had watched her stop at the far shelves, consult her list, and then, impractically and with what appeared to be complete unawareness that she was being observed, take down a volume from the philosophy section and open it. She read 2 pages. Her lips did not move, but her eyes moved at the speed of someone who is genuinely reading rather than performing the act. She looked up once, frowning slightly, as though working something out. Then she replaced the book with the same care with which she had taken it down, and she went on with her list. Julian said nothing. He replaced his own volume and stood at the gallery railing for a moment after she had gone, looking at the shelf where the philosophy book sat. He was not sure what he had seen. He was fairly sure it was not his business. He was also sure, in a way he did not immediately examine, that he would find a reason to go to the library again at the same hour. 3 days later, he found a reason. He also found, in the servants' hall the morning after, that Mrs. Holt had things to say about the new girl, if he was willing to listen, which was an unusual enough conversation with his housekeeper that he sat down and had it. Elspeth had come upon Thomas the footman in the small reception room off the east corridor, standing over a broken Sèvres vase that he had not broken. She had been passing. She had seen the look on Thomas's face, and the angle of the vase's shards on the floor, and the position of the side table. And she had understood immediately that the vase had been badly balanced and had fallen without assistance. She had also understood, from the sound of the butler's approaching steps, what was about to happen to Thomas. She had stepped into the room. She had said to the butler, very calmly, that the vase had been insecure on its support, and she had described the angle of the fall, and she had offered to explain it again if he felt the matter warranted the Marquis's attention. The butler, who was a reasonable man, had inspected the table's edge, found the truth of what she said, and absolved Thomas with a shortened dignity. Thomas had said nothing, and done nothing, but that evening he had left a small paper cone of sugared almonds on the shelf above Elspeth's basin, which was the currency available to him. Julian had listened to Mrs. Holt recount this. He had then sat for a moment with his teacup and said, "She has been here 6 weeks." 6 weeks, Mrs. Holt said. Where did she come from before the Aldridge household? Mrs. Holt said she did not know. She said the girl did not speak of it. She said there was something about her that was not quite explicable by the usual accounting of a maid's history, and she had been in service long enough to know the difference between a woman born to the station and a woman who had arrived in it by some other road. Julian thanked her and went to dress for dinner. He passed Elspeth in the corridor outside the dining room that evening, and she stood aside as she was meant to, and he noted, without meaning to, the particular quality of stillness with which she stood aside, the way it was not the stillness of deference, but of self-possession. And he kept walking. The locket made its appearance on the 12th of October. Elspeth was carrying a tray across the upper landing when her collar caught on the door handle and pulled open at the throat, and the chain slipped, and the locket fell against the outside of her dress and swung there, visible in the afternoon light of the corridor. She did not notice. Julian, coming up the stairs, noticed. He could not have said why he stopped. The locket was small and unremarkable from a distance, a common enough piece for a woman of any station. The shape of it was familiar, however, in the obscure way that objects seen in childhood are familiar. Not consciously, but in the body, in the slight arrest of breath that precedes recognition. He let her pass. He did not say anything. He stood at the top of the stairs for a moment longer than he should have. His wife had worn a locket of that shape. No, that was not it. He had seen a locket of that shape in a portrait. In the East Gallery, in the portrait of his mother as a young woman, painted the year before his own birth. There was a locket at her throat. He went to the East Gallery after supper. He looked at the portrait for some time. He told himself he was imagining things. Lady Constance was imagining things as well, or rather she was fighting the imagination with everything she possessed, which was considerable. She had fought it well for the 12 years since the accident, and she had made herself a useful and considered and disciplined woman in those years, and she had put the grief in its room and locked its door and carried the key inside her breast in the place where the grief itself had once lived. She did not speak of Elspeth. She did not visit the sealed room on the 3rd floor where her daughter's clothes still hung and her daughter's books still sat on the shelf, and a small clover crown, dried now and brown at the edges, still lay on the dressing table where a child had put it the morning before the journey. She kept a candle burning on the anniversary. That was all. That was permitted. She was in her sitting room when Mrs. Holt brought the matter of the locket to her attention, obliquely, in the way that long service makes possible, by mentioning that the new girl wore a very fine chain, for a maid, and that there seemed to be a pendant of some kind beneath her collar. Lady Constance put down her needlework. She said, "Did you see it clearly?" Mrs. Holt said she had not. Lady Constance said that was all, thank you, and dismissed her, and sat alone for a quarter of an hour with the needlework in her lap and her hands very still on it. At tea 2 days later, Miss Payne asked a visiting neighbor, Colonel Ashford's wife, whether the new maid had been clearing the conservatory, because she had found a palm frond on the upper landing that suggested a careless hand. Lady Constance said the girl's name was Elspeth, and Miss Payne said, "Yes, the new maid," and went back to her conversation. And Lady Constance watched her teacup and said nothing. The morning came when Lady Constance sent for Elspeth directly. She had debated it for 3 days. She had debated it the way sensible people debate things they know they will do regardless, cataloging the arguments against, so that the decision, when it arrived, could wear the clothes of reason. She told herself she was verifying an unlikely thing that required simple verification. She told herself she was not hoping. She sent word through Mrs. Holt that she wished her tea brought by the new girl. A small irregularity that Mrs. Holt noted without comment, being too experienced to comment on the small irregularities of employers in grief. Elspeth came along the corridor to Lady Constance's sitting room at 3:30. She was singing again, not aware of it, as before, as though the long, quiet corridor had given her the same permission the empty drawing room had given her. The same melody, soft and matter-of-fact. A garden in some unnamed summer, white roses and bees, and a small girl making crowns from whatever came to hand. Lady Constance heard her before she knocked. She sat at her writing table and gripped its edge, and did not move, until the knock came. Until she had put her face in order. Until she could say, "Come in," with a voice that gave nothing away. Elspeth entered with the tea tray and set it on the small table by the window, and arranged the cup and the pot with practiced economy. She did not look at Lady Constance directly, as was correct. Lady Constance looked at her entirely. "Where did you learn that song?" Lady Constance said. Elspeth paused in the arranging. "I am not certain, my lady. I have known it as long as I can remember. I beg your pardon if it disturbed you." "It did not disturb me." Lady Constance's voice was carefully level. "What is the name of it?" "I do not know that it has a name. I know 3 verses, and I believe there was a 4th, but I cannot recall it." She set the sugar tongs down with a small click. "My lady, is there anything else you require?" Lady Constance said, "Sit down." It was not a conventional request. Elspeth looked up for the first time, meeting the Dowager's eyes with the specific alertness of someone who has learned to assess the quality of an unusual instruction before complying with it. She saw something in the Dowager's face that she did not yet have a name for, and it made the back of her neck prickle, and she sat. Lady Constance said, "You came to Ashmore from the Aldridge household in Stretton Cross. Before the Aldridges, where were you?" The question had the precise weight of a question that has been composed and held for some time. Elspeth considered it. She had not, in 6 weeks, been asked this question by anyone at Ashmore, and she had been grateful for the silence. She looked at the window, at the autumn garden beyond it, at the bare trees against the gray sky. She said, "I do not entirely know, my lady. I was found near Stretton Cross when I was a child. Mr. Aldridge took me in. I had no memory of my name or my family." The silence in the room had a particular texture. Lady Constance said carefully, as though the word was made of glass, "When you were a child. How old?" 11, they estimated. Perhaps 11. Lady Constance's hands lay flat on the writing table. She looked at them as though she had not recently ordered them there. She said, "Your memories. Have they returned?" Elspeth studied her. "Some of them, my lady, in parts, a garden, a voice reading to me, a carriage in the dark and rain. Then nothing until Mr. Aldridge's house." She paused. "I have long thought it might be delusion. The mind in distress will construct things." "Yes," Lady Constance said. "It will." She was very still. "The locket you wear." Elspeth's hand went to her collar, an involuntary movement. She checked it. "I was wearing it when they found me, in the mud beside the road. I have always had it." Lady Constance stood. She moved to the window and stood with her back to the room and her hands clasped behind her, looking at the bare trees, and she did not speak for long enough that Elspeth understood she was not meant to speak either. At last Lady Constance said, still facing the window, "You are dismissed for this afternoon. You will take tomorrow as a day of rest. I must write some letters." Elspeth stood. She dropped her curtsy. She was at the door when Lady Constance said, without turning, "The 4th verse of your song. There is a line about a key." Elspeth went still. Lady Constance said, "That is all." Elspeth walked back to the servants' hall, with her hands perfectly composed and her heart making a very considerable noise in her chest, and she sat at the long table and looked at the grain of the wood and tried to think clearly, which she found she could not do. The notice came the following morning. It came through Mrs. Holt, who delivered it with the particular gentleness of a woman who does not like the message, but understands she is not the message, and who had clearly rehearsed the delivery. The Dowager had determined that the staffing arrangements required some adjustment. Elspeth's position at Ashmore Park would conclude at the end of the following week. A reference would be provided. There was no fault attached. It was simply necessary. Elspeth listened. She looked at Mrs. Holt's face, which was careful and sorry. And she said, "I understand." Because she did understand. And understanding was not the same as being uninjured by the thing understood. She went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed with the locket in her palm, open, the miniature face looking up at her from the gold oval. And she thought about the garden and the roses, and the fourth verse that she had never told anyone. The verse that mentioned a small gold key worn on a chain that the woman in the song had given to the child to keep safe. There was no key on the locket. There had never been a key. The chain was only the locket. She could hear the verse, all the same, as clearly as she could hear the birds outside the window, and she had heard it in the same place where she heard everything she had known before the accident, in the place that was deeper than memory, in the bone. In the servants' hall that evening, Thomas asked Mrs. Holt quietly what had become of the young woman who had saved him from the butler's displeasure, and Mrs. Holt said that the new maid was leaving at the end of the week, which was a great shame and none of their business. Julian heard it from Thomas. Thomas had not intended to tell him. He had met the Marquis in the gun-room after supper, where Julian had gone to clear his head of the company, and Thomas had been returning a pair of boots, and the encounter had lasted 4 minutes, in which Thomas had managed, through the particular combination of loyalty and poor strategic judgment available to young footmen, to convey the essential facts. Julian dismissed him and stood in the gun-room alone. He thought about the locket and the portrait in the East Gallery. He thought about the philosophy book taken from the shelf and replaced with care. He thought about the footman and the vase, and the precise economy with which the scene had been assessed and resolved. He thought about Mrs. Holt's words, something that is not quite explicable by the usual accounting of a maid's history. He thought about his mother, who had in 12 years not once dismissed a member of staff without a clear material cause, and who had sat in a sealed room at the end of the third-floor corridor with the door locked for 12 years and a candle burning on the anniversary of the accident. He went to find Mr. Norris's address in the estate records. He wrote 2 letters that night, one to Mr. Norris, the family solicitor, requesting the documentation from the file pertaining to the accident of October 1803, and in particular any inventory of the effects found at the scene. The second to Mr. Norris's office in Bath, with instructions to come to Ashmore at his earliest convenience, with all materials. He did not tell his mother. He did not tell Elspeth. He went to bed and lay awake for some hours, which was not unusual, though the subject of his wakefulness was different from its accustomed shape. Mr. Norris arrived on the 3rd day, which was the day before Elspeth's last at Ashmore. He was a small, precise man with silver spectacles and the demeanor of someone who has spent 40 years managing other people's most difficult documents, and he came with a leather case under his arm and the slightly apprehensive air of a man summoned without explanation to the home of a marquis who has not previously required his personal attendance. Julian received him in the study. He was brief. He said that he had reason to believe a matter connected to the accident of October 1803 required examination. He asked Mr. Norris to produce the effects inventory. Mr. Norris produced it. It was 3 pages, handwritten in the careful copperplate of a country coroner's office, and it itemized the contents of the carriage as they had been recovered from the road and the roadside. On the 2nd page, beneath a list of a child's clothing and a child's traveling bag, was a single line. One small oval locket, on gold chain, found in roadside mud, interior containing painted miniature portrait. Female subject, dark hair, approximately 25 years, unknown identity. Submitted for safekeeping with the attending constable, pending recovery of the child's remains. Julian read the line twice. He closed the document. He said to Mr. Norris, "I need you to stay." He went to find his mother. Lady Constance was in the drawing room with Miss Payne and the last of the house party, the Colonel's wife having prolonged her visit in the way of women who sense that something of interest is occurring in a household they are reluctant to leave. Julian came in and addressed himself to his mother with the deliberate courtesy of a man about to do something irreversible. He said, "I need to speak with you. All of you may remain, as what I have to say is not a private matter." He looked at Miss Payne. He looked at the Colonel's wife. He looked at Mrs. Holt, who had come in behind him and stationed herself near the door, because Mrs. Holt had been in service for 34 years and could read a room. Lady Constance looked at her son's face and went very still. Julian said, "Will someone bring Elspeth from the servants' hall?" Miss Payne said, "The new maid?" with the faint surprise of someone accustomed to social geography being observed. Julian said, "Her name is Elspeth Vale," and waited. There was a silence of some minutes. The fire burned. The Colonel's wife set down her needlework. Miss Payne looked at Lady Constance, whose face had closed in the particular way of faces that are managing something very large from a very small distance. Elspeth came in. She came in correctly, with the cap and the plain brown dress and the downcast eyes, and then she looked up because the quality of the room's silence told her something unusual was occurring, and she saw Julian standing by the fireplace with a document in his hand, and she saw Mr. Norris near the door, and she saw Lady Constance at her chair with both hands flat on the arms of it. And she stood still. Julian said, "Mr. Norris." He held out the document. Mr. Norris came forward and read aloud the relevant line in his careful professional voice, and the Colonel's wife made a small sound, and Miss Payne sat up very straight, and Mrs. Holt put her hand on the doorframe. Julian looked at Elspeth. He said, "May I see the locket?" It was not precisely a question. It was spoken in the level declarative form of a man who asks for things with the full weight of his certainty behind the asking, but it was careful in a way his commands were not always careful, and Elspeth understood the difference. She reached into her collar and drew the chain over her head. She held the locket out. Julian crossed the room to her, and she placed it in his open palm, and they were close enough that she could see, for the first time, that his eyes were dark gray, and that there was something in them that was not authority, and not management, and not the composed courtesy she had watched him deploy across 6 weeks of dinner parties and corridor crossings. There was something in them that was specific to this moment and to her, and she did not have a name for it yet. He opened the locket. He turned it so that Mr. Norris could see the miniature. Mr. Norris said, "Yes," in the voice of a man confirming what he had already known was true. Julian looked at his mother. Lady Constance was looking at Elspeth. She had been looking at Elspeth since she had entered the room, with the accumulated restraint of a woman who has held a thing closed for 12 years and is holding it closed for one final measured minute, and her face was entirely steady, entirely composed, and it cost her something visible to keep it so. Julian turned to the room. He turned to Miss Payne and to the Colonel's wife, and to the household gathered near the door, and he said it very simply, with the particular authority of a man who has made a decision that he intends to be permanent and public and unambiguous, and his voice was level and his posture was still, and the words had no decoration in them at all. "This is Elspeth Moreland. She comes home today." The silence afterward had a different quality than the silence before it. Miss Payne's teacup was very still in her hand. The Colonel's wife pressed her fingers to her mouth. Mrs. Holt made a sound that she did not try to suppress or explain. Julian stood where he was, between Elspeth and the room, and he did not look at the room. Lady Constance rose from her chair. She crossed the room with the measured step of a woman who is not going to rush this, who is not going to perform it, who has been building toward this for 12 years without knowing she was building toward anything at all. She stopped in front of Elspeth. She lifted one hand and placed it against the girl's cheek. And she looked at the face she had been arguing herself out of recognizing for 6 weeks, and she said in a voice that was entirely without its usual armor, "There you are." That was all. That was enough. Elspeth's composure, which had survived a great many difficult mornings, did not survive that. The room managed itself. These things do. Julian moved to speak to Mr. Norris about what would need to be formalized, and the Colonel's wife took Miss Payne firmly by the elbow and steered her toward the door with the competent grace of a woman who has navigated awkward social moments in 4 counties, and Mrs. Holt stationed herself at the hall entrance and relayed quiet instructions to the staff who had gathered there, and the drawing room was allowed to contain only what it needed to contain. The room on the 3rd floor had been sealed for 12 years. It was Elspeth who carried the key up the stairs that evening, given to her by Lady Constance with both hands and no ceremony, the way one gives something back that has been held in trust. The corridor was dim. The candle Elspeth held threw a small warm circle on the green carpet runner, and her footsteps were very quiet, and she stood for a moment before the door before she turned the key. The room smelled of cedar and lavender and thyme. It was very tidy, the way rooms are kept tidy by the grief that cannot bear disorder. A child's books on the shelf, the spine straight. A child's dresses in the wardrobe, which she did not yet open. On the dressing table, the dried clover crown, brown at the edges, smaller than she remembered. The way all things from childhood are smaller when met again from the other side of the years. She remembered making it. She remembered the summer grass under her knees and the particular patience required for the threading of clover stems, and the voice above her saying that she would run out of clover before she finished, and her own certainty that she would not. She would not. She had enough. She had put it on the dressing table the morning of the journey, because she was going to wear it in the carriage to make her mother laugh. And then there had been packing and rushing, and she had forgotten. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. The fire had been lit in the room below, and the warmth was beginning to come up through the floor, the way warmth comes in old houses through the bones of the walls. From the drawing room she could hear, very faintly, the low sound of Julian's voice and his mother's voice in conversation, the specific rhythm of 2 people who have known each other too long and too well and are now reorienting around a new fact of the world. Julian knocked at the open door. He stood at the threshold with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her on the edge of the child's bed in the small room full of all the relics of the self she had not been permitted to keep. And his expression was the expression she had seen in the drawing room when their hands had met over the locket, the one she had not yet named. She said, "It is very strange to come back to a room you do not entirely remember leaving." He said, "I imagine it is." He came to the threshold, but not over it. He was being careful in the way he had been careful in the drawing room, the way that was different from his courtesy, which was a form of management, and different from his commands, which were a form of care. This was something else. You may have whatever time you need. She looked at the clover crown on the dressing table. She looked at the window, which showed the night garden below and the sky above it, with its cold autumn stars. She had looked at these stars from this window, she thought, though she could not exactly remember the looking. She had known them by their names. She had learned their names from the book on the third shelf that was still there, that had been waiting 12 years for her to read it again. She said, "I do not know how to be her, the person this room was made for. I have been someone else for a very long time." Julian said from the threshold, "She is perhaps not so different from you as you think." He said it without flourish, in the level way he said things when he meant them most. And then he was quiet for a moment. "The locket is yours," he said. "It has always been yours." He left her to the room and the candle and the dried brown crown of clover on the table. She sat until the house settled into its night sounds around her, until the voices below grew quiet, and the fire's crackle in the floor became the only conversation. She picked up the clover crown with both hands, very carefully, the way one picks up things that are old and dry, and have been perfectly preserved by a grief that could not bear to let them go. It held together. The stems had been threaded by an 11-year-old girl with too much patience, and the absolute conviction that she had enough, and they had held for 12 years, and they held now. She set it down. She did not put it on. She thought she might, eventually. She thought there was time. In the spring, Lady Constance walked the garden at Ashmore for the first time in 12 years, without the specific weight of the sealed corridor pressing on the morning. Elspeth walked beside her with her bonnet ribbons untied and her sleeves pushed to the elbow in the way that her mother found cheerfully uncivilized and would not say so. The roses were not yet white. They would be white in June. Elspeth knew this and could not have said how she knew it, and her mother knew it too, and between them the knowledge sat quietly, warm and unremarked, the way shared knowledge sits when it belongs to two people and no one else. Julian was at the terrace above them. He had been there for some time, longer than was necessary, doing nothing that required him to be at a terrace at 8 in the morning, except watch the garden below him, which was a somewhat transparent enterprise that he had not yet been called on to explain. He had been learning, slowly, in the way men learn things they have argued themselves away from, how to occupy a house that had once been only the place where his wife had died and was becoming the place where something else entirely was occurring, something quieter and more persistent than grief, something that had been building since a chamois cloth and a shelf of philosophy books and a footman and a vase, and the specific posture of a woman who stands aside in a corridor not with deference but with self-possession. Elspeth looked up from the rose bed and saw him at the terrace and did not look away, which she had recently decided was a liberty she was permitted, given that they had agreed 3 weeks ago in the library after supper, with considerable economy of language on both sides, that she was the sort of person he intended to make permanent, and she was the sort of person who had decided to permit it. He lifted one hand in the small salute that was the nearest he came to expressiveness in the morning. She lifted hers. Her mother, who had been waiting for some months, permitted herself a very small smile in the direction of the first white rosebud, which was not yet open, but was very close. The locket was on the dressing table in the third-floor room. Lady Constance had asked to keep it for a while, to look at the miniature portrait of herself at 25, and Elspeth had said, "Of course, take it. It was yours first." The room was no longer sealed. The window had been opened in the spring air, and the cedar smell had gone, and the clover crown was still on the dressing table, because neither of them had moved it, by some unspoken agreement that it had earned its place, The books were still on the shelf. Elspeth had been through all of them. Some she remembered. Some she read as new. She was building, she thought, a self that was larger than either of the selves she had previously been, the one before the accident and the one after it. Both were hers. She was not required to choose. The first rose opened on the 14th of June, white and wide and slightly extravagant, exactly as she had known it would be. If this story found its way to you, if Elspeth's 12 years outside a room she could not name moved something you have carried yourself, leave a word below. Stories like this one exist because you stay until the last rose.